5, 4, 3, 2, 1. We're recording. We are a go. Welcome back to the Dangerzone.
Howdy.
We're still here with We the Willing, continuing our series together. And this episode, we're going to be covering death and dying. So let's... do you remember the first time you lost a patient?
Death
or
and
lost
dying.
someone?
Yeah, I actually can remember that pretty vividly. We were in a different country at the time, and we had a patient that we originally came up to. You know, he got injured from a IED out there. He ended up getting blown up. He was a civilian, and showed up to our ECP, which is our entry control checkpoint. And we took him in. I was actually the guy who went down there to check him out. And he was still breathing at the time. It kind of scared the shit out of me, looking at somebody with, no legs or missing like an arm. It's like, wow. It's kind of weird. He had it's like wrapped in a blanket when they gave him to us, kind of how they transported him. I guess it's a little difficult to transport someone that's undergoing a multi-system trauma casualty. But, they brought him over and, you quickly start doing your thing. We ended up bringing him up to our aid station, and we started going to work on him, doing what, we're taught how to do. And for sure, I thought, we'd been through a couple casualties at this point in time. Definitely thought, this guy's definitely in good hands, It's one of those things to where I felt confident. There's a lot of people around me that were helping out. We had a pretty good crew. So looking at it, we're probably going to be successful with it. And turns out we worked on him for about an hour, and we weren't successful at all. Patient ended up expiring. And I just remember a lot of emotions at that point. You figure at that point in time, you're going to feel sad or, sad or sorrow. That's the only time, every time I dealt with death up until that point, it's like a sad, somber moment. But, this time I was actually angry. I was angry because it was just an emotion that kind of overtook my body. And, at the time I couldn't really explain why I was angry until, I started discovering about the grieving process. But that anger was the first thing to hit me. And I was angry because I had taken an individual, got him before he had crossed over, and, under our care, he expired. Yeah. And it's super frustrating.
That's exactly what I was about to say. That has to be super frustrating. And you beat me to the punch. It's like, I could see where putting in work to save someone and then you don't achieve your goal, causes the frustration, which causes the anger, which is, one of the, like you mentioned, is part of the grieving process, or DABDA is the short term, which we'll explain right now, is denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance.
Yep.
Are kind of like these steps. And I guess you don't necessarily start with one. You can kind of end up, I think a lot of people are taught first you're in denial, then anger, all this stuff. But really, you can find yourself in any point at any
I remember
time.
first learning about DABDA. I can't recall where we first learned it. Somewhere, we picked up the acronym along the way. But yeah, it is one of those things. It is the process of grieving. It is a process of dealing with, any type of grieving, death, a breakup, a friendship that has gone, off kilter.
Yeah, losing a pet.
Yeah. So it's not just specific to, somebody that is dying, but that process itself, I think the understanding of the process helps with dealing with somebody's death.
How long did that anger last, and did it subside pretty quickly? Like, were you able to move to acceptance, or like what?
Yeah, I think fairly quickly. When you sit there and realize like we did all we could, and he was in a place where he had the best chance of making it, if there were any chance at all.
Yeah,
I think we just got the poor guy a little too late.
it was time. It was his time to receive the death guard. Like
Yeah.
that
was one of those things. But yeah, that process is fluid. You know, it moves. You bounce between, you know, like you said, denial, anger, bargaining, depression. And then the funny thing about it is too, you don't just deal with it then and there.
Right.
I think DABDA would come along, you know, maybe different times of the year when somebody, you know, it's an anniversary, somebody's passing, or, you know, when you look at a photograph and you may go through, you know, a little bit of that process.
Yeah. I would like to talk about, you know, so we've already touched on the, you know, the grieving process and the things that will happen just kind of naturally when these things occur in people's life.
Yeah.
But I would like to talk about coping with it. You know, the things you do to help yourself when you find yourselves in one of these times, like in denial, anger, bargaining, depression, or acceptance. Like you said, was just kind of reprocessing everything. And I'm sure you guys talked to as a group, kind of like, hey, what did we do? And you came to the conclusion, like, we did everything we could. And so that helped you move out of that anger process, right?
Definitely.
So that was like a coping mechanism, if you think about it. It was a reaching out to each other and discussing it, right? Mm-hmm. And then coming, you know, to a point where you're okay with what happened, which would move you to acceptance or whatever.
So do you have any experience with, you know, one of your first deaths that you coped with?
Yeah. So similar story, but different is I was on my third deployment and I was really close, working really closely with the Afghan local police. And one of their guys stepped on an IED and we could hear it go off. They were like, you know, a mile away or so. And it took them forever to bring this guy to me. And I'm exaggerating by forever, but it took them 45 minutes to transport him. And it was like pretty much a straight shot right down this road. And they all had vehicles and stuff. So I was like on the phone with them and everything, like, hey, you need to, like, we heard something happen. Are you guys, like, is everybody okay? And they're like, you know, we find out somebody's injured. And I'm like, hey, you know, let's get him up here. And it still took him like 45 minutes. And when I brought him in, he was a triple amp, missing both legs and arm, and a partial amp. And he didn't have any tourniquets on him at all. And I actually thought he was dead when I first saw him, because the guy had just been bleeding out for like 45 minutes. Oh. And it didn't make any sense, like, that he would be alive.
Yeah.
But of course I go and, like, you know, check him and, like, you know, checking for responsiveness, and I give him like a sternal rub and he's like, you know, I like fucking hear him breathing. I like check, he's got a pulse. I'm like, we need to get tourniquets on this guy like right now.
Yeah.
And so we get tourniquets on him right away. And I'm like, somehow this dude's still alive. So we transport him into the, you know, the BAS once we like initially stabilized him, and we're trying everything, you know. He had a lot of like blast injuries sort of around his mouth and stuff. So I ended up, you know, criking him, and, you know, we were bagging him and everything. And then he just, you know, over time, he didn't make it no matter what we did. You know, it was a little too little too late, you know?
So do you think you immediately went into that DABDA processing of that grieving?
It was, I think I went straight to acceptance with the coping mechanism of comedy, which I think is very common within the healthcare field.
That's a pretty big one.
Is, and it was kind of weird. It was out of place for me. You know, other people are like moving into like denial, or they're in like, you know, depression, or they're like really sad about what happened. And I'm sitting there laughing, which is not, you know, what somebody would say is normal, but it was my way of just being like, this situation was fucked from the beginning.
Yeah,
like,
absolutely.
And thinking of, like, I'm sitting there thinking in my head, like, trying to make sense of, why did these guys take forever bringing me this dude?
Yeah.
Like, why didn't he have tourniquets? And it's not like these were just civilian Afghans. Like, these are local police that we had put through extensive medical training.
So they were trained to do what they needed to.
And so I went and met with them
life.
afterwards. And, you know, I guess what helped me being able to go through that process so quickly of just kind of getting a quick laugh and then moving on to acceptance was I was able to go and talk with these guys and be in a position where I was completely okay, right? Mm-hmm. And so I was able to talk really seriously with them about the whole situation and, you know, go over it. And what was weird about it, though, is I approached him. I was like, you guys know how to do tourniquets, right? And I wasn't like insulting them or anything. And they're like, oh yeah. They all get excited, and they like, one guy jumped on the ground and they like whip off one of their what is that? Like their
schmog.
Yeah. And their schmog, and they like bust out a tourniquet on each other. Like, after that's all I said, like, you guys know how to do tourniquets, and they just immediately went into like showing me how they know how to do it. And they were all excited. And I was like, well, you guys, like, you know, this guy needed like 4 of them, and you guys didn't do it. And they were just kind of like, well, inshallah.
Inshallah is
like,
a
whatever
thing.
happens. Like,
yeah.
And I'm like, no, you know, that I was like, that's great. But at the same time, he doesn't have to die. You know, you have this. And so that was just an interesting dynamic.
One thing that's always been interesting for me is the different cultures and how they see death.
Yeah.
You know, I've definitely experienced some of the inshallah mindset, I guess you can call it. And, you know, it's different. You still got to respect it, you know.
Mm-hmm.
There's people that believe that when it's your time, it's your time. And I think that's one of those things to where, you know, inshallah, like, if it's meant to be, it's meant to be.
Yeah.
As far as, you know, dying.
And then think of like that dude's quality of life. If he had survived.
Yeah.
That's kind of, you know, most people would just say like, yeah, it's better for him to be alive and figure it out. But dude, it's not necessarily the best life for a quadruple amputee, which he was probably going to be in Afghanistan.
I mean, there's some strong humans out there who deal with that on a daily basis.
Yeah.
And I've got the utmost respect for those people that, you know, are injured, and they do grind it out, you know. They make a way for their life, and they're secure with themselves enough to be like, you know what? Maybe I don't have legs, but I can still do every fucking thing that you can with legs. I mean, these people are winning competitions and races that, like, I'd be smoked to do, you know?
Yeah.
It's pretty impressive to see those things, and my respect definitely goes out to those guys.
You see people doing stuff that they weren't able to do before they got wounded.
Yeah.
Which is really powerful.
It's super powerful. I wonder why, like, oh man, I'm not doing anything like that right now.
But it is just, you know, different cultures see it differently.
I think the quality of life is a big thing. You know, I saw that personally with my grandfather. So he ended up having a stroke one day. He's older. He ended up having a stroke, happened to be there. And, you know, just seeing how scary that was, you know, like, I remember my grandma calling me down, like, late at night. You know, whenever she's calling, there's probably something going on. And they're like, hey, come downstairs. You know, your grandpa's, like, acting funny. End up going downstairs, and he's, like, you know, slurring his speech, and he can't, you know, get up. And I was actually going through a certified nursing assistant course at the time, so it was kind of like my first bout into medicine in high school. And I was just like, wow, I recognized it immediately. I was like, he's probably having a stroke. Like, let's call 911 and figure this out, because there's nothing I can do right now. So we ended up calling 911, and, you know, fast forward, he ended up having a stroke, and he ended up being with us for a period of 1 year before he had his second stroke, which ultimately ended his life. But I'll tell you, man, that 1 year with my grandfather, you know, we like to see it as that person. For us, it was just like, hey, it was our grandfather's like last hurrahs, is our time for that 1 year to kind of say goodbye to him and stuff. But I'll tell you, man, like looking back now as an adult, or, you know, however old I am nowadays, looking back and looking at that, I just realized like, wow, I don't know if he was all too happy back then, because, I mean, to give you an example, you know, he was wheelchair bound. He was paralyzed. Mm-hmm. His whole, I think his right side was paralyzed. It could have been his left, but half his body was paralyzed, so he wasn't able to walk. And this man was somebody that was completely independent. He did everything by himself, for himself. He was real proud of that fact, you know. He was an orphan who grew up in the Philippines, and he ended up joining the Navy, and he was like his own self-made man, you know. Wasn't a man who had a lot of money or anything like that, but he was very prideful and just, you know, doing what he did. He liked to make things, and he had this obsession with like cinematography. He always watched videos and stuff, but I always saw him as somebody who was independent as a younger kid. So during this year-long time that he was, you know, saying his goodbye to the family, seeing him in that wheelchair, I didn't think nothing of it as a kid, but now that I can reflect on those things, I remember, you know, going through the mall, pushing around a Macy's or something, mm-hmm. and we would go in front of a mirror. And you know what he'd always do? He'd always look at himself in the mirror and give himself like the middle finger. And, you know, I think I wrote that off as a kid, be like, oh, he's trying to be funny. But, you know, it's pretty powerful to look at now and realize, like, maybe he was just completely unhappy with who he'd become. You know, that stroke had just completely debilitated him. Not so much his body, but maybe his mind. He wasn't as proud as he used to be because he wasn't able to walk. He wasn't as proud as he used to be because he wasn't able to do things for himself.
Yeah.
You know, in that sense, he was, you know, we were changing his diapers and feeding him and changing his clothes. Like, I don't think that's a life I would want to live personally, you know, but seeing that quality of life, I think, wrapping it around to, sometimes I wonder if that first stroke would have been better for him to kind of pass off then.
Yeah.
Or whether it was, you know, something that was needed for us, for the family, for that year, for closure. But
well, didn't he have like sort of a special way of going out though?
He definitely did. You know, we one of the things with death, I think we don't realize, is something you tend to see when I think you're experienced it, or you've experienced death and being around death for, you know, a couple times in your life. His death was a little odd in the sense that he didn't go when we thought he was going to go. You know, after his second stroke, he ended up going to the hospital, and it was recommended that he'd been put on hospice because his brain bleeding from the stroke was just so severe that, you know, there was no way he was going to make any type of recovery. And at that point in his life, he was in a vegetative state.
Yeah.
And that was hard for us, but I think with that year, you know, we were almost going through that dab already, and I think, you know, there are times where we've definitely accepted the fact that he'll never be the person he was before, and that's why we need to kind of band together as a family and help as much as we could. But the weirdness in his death wasn't how he went out specifically, but almost when he went out. So we ended up putting him under hospice, and he ended up going to one of our family members' houses, and we called everyone that was around. I mean, we had 30, 40 people over the house, and everyone was saying their goodbyes and just holding his hand and, you know, giving him kisses, and we all told him we love him and stuff and how much we're going to miss him. But there was one member of the family who was forward deployed on a ship at the time, and he was the last person that we needed to be the full family. I'm talking everyone, uncles, mm-hmm. cousins, fucking the whole 9 yards. And he was the last person. He was that last missing piece to kind of complete the family. Well, my family, he ended up coming like 3 days later, I think. and he ended up getting off his ship, came out to California, and as soon as he pulled up, we went right to the room, and he had a conversation with my grandfather, and for the most part, he kind of like said his piece. And what I say was weird about the timing of that was when he said his piece, my grandmother went up to my grandfather and told him very, very intimately, very closely, but we could all hear it because it was really quiet and somber. She was like, Lang, which is honey in Tagalog, Filipino, said, Lang, we love you. Your family's here. We're all here for you. And if you're ready to go away or pass away, it's okay. We're here. Like, we're ready if you're ready.
Yeah.
And I'm talking within like minutes, my grandfather ended up expiring.
Wow.
And it was so incredible the way, that weird or quirkiness of death, how it works out that way. Because, with his extent of injuries, he should have been dead probably within that first 16 hours leaving the hospital.
Yeah.
But to have someone hold on for 72 hours for that last puzzle piece to kind of bring it all together.
And the strangeness part of it is just
absolutely.
like, you said they were saying he's like clinically like not there, right?
Yeah. So how can my grandfather perceive something or understand something that my grandma's telling him? And in that instant, within minutes, our fear was that he was going to die in the middle of the night and that we wouldn't be there because, we all got to sleep. Can't pack 40 dudes in a room, 40 people in a room. But
I got a strange story that's not about losing someone like that, but it's a surrounding death and something similar to that.
Okay.
But I guess to tie it in with the coping mechanisms, it goes back to when I was a casket bearer, like I talked about in the last podcast, is I think it's very similar. People who work in either, the funeral industry or just the people who run military funerals, it's a very somber duty, and you have to be very stoic when you're doing it.
Definitely.
You can't show any emotion, and like that's the family's time to be emotional, right?
Yeah.
You're just providing. Our goal is to provide the perfect ceremony for them, and like to honor their loved one, because it's this very, it's like in the steps, right? It's like you're finally coming to terms with like this person's like being laid in the ground or entombed, if they're depending on whatever's happening, but it's a closure process for the family, right?
Absolutely.
And the presenting of the flag is this very like finalizing moment, and it's super emotional, but you have to keep your shit together. And so we'd use humor a lot. Like we'd get back on the bus and, this isn't stuff probably people want to hear, but we're laughing about, silly stuff that happened, the uncle who was in the back and he like tripped over some shit and, knocked over some flowers or something. And it's, I guess, us focusing on those things instead of, the really sad emotional part of our job.
Yeah.
And that's just how we coped with it. And it didn't hit me till years later.
Do you feel in that moment like it was almost like unwarranted? Like, oh man, I probably shouldn't be laughing about shit right now. Like now looking back at it, you realize almost why you did what you did.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes and no. You, in that moment back then, you're just like, it's your job and it's what you're doing every day. It's not like, hey, we had somebody die this month, let's go out. We were doing like 5 ceremonies a day in Arlington.
That's
so
incredible.
You're just like, I would compare it to like, ER nurse or ER doctor who's seeing people die like every day, like in a busy city, or whatever. It's just a constant thing. And it's that numbness that you build up. And they prepare for you for this in training. It's not like they just throw you into Arlington Cemetery and they're like, here, you're doing a funeral. You got to work up towards that, and like you'll go out and do these smaller funerals where it's you and a senior guy that takes you out and he's like mentoring you as you're like going through the process. You don't hand the flag away, so you're already in some funerals where you're not, in that emotional like lock in with a
You
family
kind of
member.
build up to that.
Yeah, so you kind of like build up this numbness,
Yeah.
over time, and it just becomes this normal thing.
I think
And so,
I think that's a good reflection on how, the grieving process is something that's built up over time.
yeah,
We talked about earlier how dealing with death, I think people that are around death
mm-hmm.
can deal with it a lot better, based on what you're saying.
Yeah. And I would say, one of the other coping mechanisms is talking with others. It's like not isolating yourself. And in these ceremonies, we're all together. Like we're getting back in the bus, and this whole crew. Like the casket bearers, we're a separate unit from everybody else, and we were like this brotherhood. It was like we were super tight, And so I would think those relationships, like those strong relationships where we're able to talk about these things,
definitely
it helped. And so
you're talking about a case with like a strangeness that you
yeah. So but before that, like I didn't realize like how much this stuff affected me till I went to the Reagan Presidential Library in California.
Okay.
On a tour there, and we were going through the thing, and it was like a pictorial display and they had like items all from his presidency, and then at the end it gets to like his funeral procession. There's pictures on the walls of like the caisson, which is a wagon, and like the horses and all the casket bearers standing there, and I knew those dudes. I showed up to the honor guard right after Reagan's funeral.
No shit.
And only the highest guys would be on the presidential funeral, right? That were casket bearers that had worked their way up. And so when I showed up, those were the highest guys, and those were the guys that trained me how to be a casket bearer. Wow. And so the guys that took me out on my first funerals, like, and I ended up working my way up to being on the same level as them and doing funerals with them, before they left. Wow. So it was just like all of a sudden it was this connection, and I didn't have to have that wall up anymore, and I was out of the military. So it was just like I really didn't have to have that wall up, and it was just all these emotions just came flooding in
just at the same time.
And luckily I lost my tear ducts in the war, so I can't cry, but if I
hell yeah,
dude, I say that quote all the time. Nobody ever knows what it's from. It's from Monsters vs. Aliens, the animated movie.
I don't think I've seen that movie
The general says it. Anyways, yeah, but it was just all of a sudden I felt like all those emotions compacted from all those funerals I did over 2 years, like at once. It was pretty overwhelming. Like I almost just broke down in the presidential library there. But so back to this strange ceremony, there was a few that like, even while I had that wall up, they stood out to me. And I talked about the last podcast about the recon guys they found in Vietnam and brought back and stuff. And that was really impactful. And then there was this other one that was strange. All right. So it was one of the ceremonies not in Arlington. It was at Maryland National Cemetery, Veteran Cemetery. And the surrounding cemeteries, we wouldn't always send out a whole crew of 6 guys to like carry the casket, fold the flag and everything. We'd just send 2 guys to fold the flag and present it, and 1 guy to play a fake bugle, which I have some funny stories about that later for another podcast. Again, it goes back to the humor thing.
Yeah.
Like, but so you have 3 guys, right? And the family uses their own pallbearers, like, family members, to like escort the casket.
And those are the ones that actually hold the casket?
Yeah, and we just kind of walk like in front and behind it. And then, we walk, I think we walked in front of it holding the flag was on the casket. Yeah, no, we walk either like in front of it and behind it. And then once they set up, then we like post up. All the family sits down, and we're like standing next to the casket while they're doing, the priest does his deal, and we're standing there the whole time. And then we play taps, and then we do the ceremonial fold of the flag, and then we present it. And so if there's anything, so there's a lot of different things that no ceremony is the same, right?
Yeah.
And sometimes there's, the family's doing something different or this or that. And the funeral liaison guy will come up to you and let you know, and he'll say like, hey, some guy's gonna stand up and hold the boombox and play this guy's favorite song or something, and you're like, okay, so not to like go into the flag fold and stuff too early, So for this one particularly, he came up to us ahead of time before he let the family come up, and he's like, hey, just so you guys know, the widow, this was a World War II vet, Navy World War II vet. He's like, his wife, she has Parkinson's. She's like, stroked out. Like, she is not, she's like totally out of it.
So not alert to anything.
Yeah. So not alert, not like pretty unresponsive.
Okay.
She's like got tremors and stuff. And he basically said she won't be able to hold the flag in her lap. Like, she probably won't even know it's there.
Wow.
When you give it to her. So the daughter is going to hold it in her lap next to her. Okay. And just so you know that, so you're like, okay, that's not like the weirdest thing I've heard during a funeral, Yeah. So I was in the head position, which is the guy that gives away the flag. And so comes time, we do our fold, and I can see her the whole time during the ceremony sitting there. She's just off to my left. So I can see her out of my peripheral vision, and she's just like, her head is slumped over to the left, like her chin's kind of like at her shoulder. Mm-hmm. And she's like just shaking and just like totally seemed unaware of what was happening and just shaking, and just not watching. And so we finish the fold. I do my final checks, and I turn to present the flag to her, and I get down on my knee. And as soon as I get down on my knee, she lifts her head up, and her tremors stop, and she locks eyes with me and started crying as I say the bearer's speech, as I'm like, on behalf of the President of the United States and a grateful nation and proud Navy, I present you this national ensign in dedication to your loved one's service. During that whole time, she was completely locked in and just like started bawling. And then I stand up and like salute her, and as I'm turning away, her head immediately falls back to her shoulder, and like her eyes kind of like drift off. You know how you can like see the life in somebody's eyes or whatever, like sparkle or whatever. Yeah. And maybe somebody that's out of it, you can tell nobody's there. That's how it was. Like, she like came to and was like totally with it in that moment, and then went back to it. And that's like, again, she wasn't dying, right? Yeah. But it was this closure piece for her husband, right? Who she's loved for, this is a World War II vet, so God knows how long these two were married, and it was like this final moment of closure for her. Like, that's how important that the presentation of that flag is to the family members. And
I wonder what makes that happen, like the human body and its will to, to deal with something like death. Like, it's crazy. I mean, you hear all kinds of crazy stories about how, like, people that should be dead aren't dead to this day because, of the willpower, like the mind to kind of overcome some of those things.
Well, I would say I have the willpower to be invincible. You want to talk about strange? You've seen the movie Lawless, right?
I love that movie.
So the Bondurant brothers, their oldest brother like went to World War I and like the second youngest or whatever went to World War I and got shot up and came back, and he's like alive, and there's like this sort of folklore around them that they were like unkillable,
building their own legend.
Yeah. And way before this movie came out, I don't know where this started, but I think it's just how I kind of go through life, just thinking out, believing I'm invincible, and it allowed me to do a lot of like extraordinary things. When you're not worried about dying, you're able to like accomplish some like when fear, when you let fear go out the window, it lets you do things that would stop a lot of people from doing it.
Definitely.
Because they let fear, like fear of death, get in the way. But so back to that, my brother, the night before, so he was blown up in Afghanistan in 2008. And the night before he got blown up, he called me and we were talking on the phone, and he was like, at the end of the phone call, I said, hey, remember, you're a brown boy and we're invincible. And he was blown up the next day and he survived. And so it just like solidified that
this is a
tall
fact.
tale. Yeah. And then, I've had my near-death experiences where maybe I should have. And here I am today. So
the power of sheer will.
Yeah. Maybe there's some truth to that.
That movie's the reason why I have a cardigan hanging up in my closet.
Yeah.
That I never wear.
But yeah, dude, I mean, again, I think back to, the process of grieving, right?
Yeah.
It's death is one. I mean, I think we kind of talked about some taboo stuff at the end where it's like the weirdness or the strangeness that can be involved with dying, right? Like like your grandfather kind of somehow waiting for that moment to pass, this lady somehow coming to, my brother somehow surviving death when he definitely should have died in that blast. Like, death can be a very strange and taboo topic.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's important for people to talk about it.
Absolutely.
And again, if people find themselves in the dabdo, right, and let's say somebody in denial, figuring out a way to like help support that person,
Mm-hmm.
and help them through the process, because it is a process.
Yeah.
For everyone involved, and whether you shoot straight through it or not, it's death is a constant. It's something that everybody will deal with, whether they meet it someday themselves, like, or at some point somebody is going to die, or somebody is going to have somebody that dies.
Absolutely. I mean, what do they say? Death and taxes are the only sure things in life.
Right.
And that's true. I think you hit it on the head. The process of dealing with death is something that I don't think a lot of people recognize. I think it's something they understand, like, hey, when this person dies, I'm going to be sad. But all those extra things, like bargaining is such a huge one. And we think about that in
Why
a
don't you
sense
explain it a little bit? Because people
bargaining
might not be able to understand what that means just based off of the word.
So bargaining, I remember doing some bargaining when my grandfather was in the ICU having his first stroke. And that's when you're sitting there, whether you're praying to God or you're telling yourself, like, I'll never do this if, he comes out alive, or, I'll give this up, or I'll be this certain way.
Yeah.
You hear that a lot, and, you don't think of it as bargaining, but there you are bargaining. You're bargaining.
Take my life instead.
Yeah.
Like,
I wish he doesn't feel any pain. I wish I could take on that pain. But you have this self-reflection of you trying to bargain with something. And if you know that, and that bargaining may be putting you into a depression itself,
mm-hmm.
And if you can identify those things, or possibly identify those in other people that are actively grieving, letting them know that that's a natural process. Because I remember sitting there as a kid wondering, like, yo, should I feel this way? Like, should I be, like, bargaining? Like, man, I wish I was better to my grandpa. I wish I took more advantage of those things. Those in the sense are, a little bit of bargaining,
Yeah.
But they're also one of those things that kind of reminds you how fragile life is.
Also, yeah. And just understanding that people may be going through this stuff even when dying's not happening, right?
Yeah.
Like we talked, you referenced earlier, is like on the anniversary of somebody's death, somebody can find themselves falling back into depression based on it, or be angry during that time. And if you're in a relationship with that person or you're friends with this person, you might be like, why are they being an asshole, or why are they like isolating themselves from me right now? And it could be that this is a time of year that they're like, they dealt with some death, or it's the anniversary of somebody that they had a loved one pass, or a friend, or and I would say that's the important reason to be familiar with this, is so you can kind of recognize and think to ask somebody about that, or help them not be isolated, because again, like I said, one of the important coping mechanisms is talking to other people.
Absolutely.
Finding, if you're the person that is in the grieving process, you need to try and find somebody you can talk about with it, and or just, if you're not going through a grieving process, being the one that's available to talk to, or directing them to somebody. Like, let's say you don't have the faculties or the wherewithal to be available to somebody to help them through this, like being willing to like steer them towards somebody that can,
Definitely.
But dude, yeah, I think death and dying is an important topic, and I'm glad we're able to talk about it. And
I would definitely ask the audience to do some research on it, because I think it's a topic that you don't have to be anything special to be someone that's faced with death all the time.
Right.
You could be anybody, because like I said, the only thing that are sure is death and taxes.
Yeah.
And getting familiar with the grieving process, I think, will ultimately help yourself and help others around you. And in the end, like giving back, being able to give back to those people, like, hey, understand that this is a process. We're going to be able to get through it, and it's a natural part of life.
Yeah.
Really natural part of life.
Cool. Well, hey, that's Odin coming in here giving me some nice face licks, but let's.
It's a good way to end the podcast.
This is a good way. Oh, he's coming full throttle here.
You think he's going through dabbing right now?
Oh yeah, he's.
You got some acceptance going on?
Well, all right. We'll go ahead and end this one, but. Hey,
he's looking at my face.
I enjoyed the talk, and keep tuned in. We got some more series coming up with We the Willing. Find them on Instagram at We the Willing Collective, right?
We WTWcollective.com, and then We the Willing Collective on Instagram.
Cool. All right, man. It was good talking with you about death.
Definitely.
Look forward to our next talk.